Okay, so hello and welcome, listeners. I am Michelle Naude, and I work as an English academic in MANCOSA School of Education. Today, MANCOSA, specifically the iTeach Lab, has the privilege of welcoming poet Ada Limón in honor of Women's Month. Ada, on behalf of MANCOSA, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Absolute pleasure from my side. For those who don't know, Miss Limón is a writer and teacher living and working in the USA. She studied theater and fine arts and has won an extensive list of awards, including the Chicago Literary Award for Poetry, the Autumn House Poetry Prize, the Pearl Poetry Prize, the Pushcart Prize, the National Book Critics Circle Award, and she was a finalist for the 2015 National Book Award for Poetry. Her collections of poetry, available on Amazon, are Lucky Wreck, This Big Fake World, Sharks in the Rivers, Bright Dead Things, and The Carrying. As previously mentioned, the interview is in honor of Women's Month. South Africa commemorates Women's Month as a tribute to the 20,000 women who marched to the Union buildings in 1956 to protest the past laws which had just been extended to women. Today, we take August as an opportunity to celebrate the contribution of every woman to society. So with this auspicious month in mind, I will be chatting to Ada about poetry, social media, COVID-19, the changing nature of literature, and of course, gender. So my first question is, the poet June Jordan talks about how all poetry is essentially a political act because the point of it is to convey truth, which I think is quite funny because it aligns politics with truth. But would you consider yourself to be a political writer?
I think that what I'm always trying to do is to get at some truth that's inside of me and make sure that that's aligning with how I feel in an authentic way. So yeah, I think that my politics are on the page for sure, because what I'm paying attention to, what I'm writing about, what I'm engaged with, what conversations I'm engaged with are all there. And I feel like, you know, it is a time when if we write about a tree, we may not be making an overtly political poem, but the attention to nature and the attention to tree suddenly then involves us with eco-poetics, right? And the idea of the other and the idea that we are celebrating the life of the tree and decentering the human. I mean, there's lots of ways in which poetry can be seen as a political act, and it's not always the overt rant or polemic. Those are the poems that I tend to veer away from because I feel as if those types of political poems can sometimes not feel as authentic, or they feel like they're really wonderful in the moment, but they maybe don't have the longevity.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think what June Jordan means by that is the authentic. What is a poem if not authentic? Yeah. And it also calls in the idea of, you know, the personal is political. Absolutely. Well, what changes have you seen throughout your career in terms of the space for women in poetry?
I think that's an interesting question. I feel like there has definitely been a movement in the last 20 years to really engage with the poetry by women writers in a way that I don't think has been engaged with. I think when I was coming of age as a poet, and even when I first started graduate school, there were wonderful poets writing. I was studying with wonderful poets. I had amazing teachers. But I do think there was a certain way in which the outside world took on a level of criticism in which they were sometimes relegated to the domestic, to the idea of feelings, right? That women dealt with feelings, men dealt with truth. You know, like it was, that to me was very interesting. And even when my first, I would say my first 3-4 books came out, I did notice that there was a a real engagement with the emotional connection, which is great. And I want the emotional connection. I'm not in this not to have an emotional
Of
connection.
course.
But I was interested that they never brought up some of the formal things, or, you know, the idea of craft. And I think that is shifting. I think the criticism is shifting. And I think it's particularly because we now have globally much more women writing criticism and publishing magazines.
Absolutely. It's interesting. I love how you speak about feelings, but if you look at it as well, it's that traditional dichotomy of, you know, man is culture, woman is nature. So that's very interesting. And leading on from that question, I've noticed that in the media, in academia, we've started talking about women who write as female poets, as opposed to just poets. So do you think that this is divisive? Do you think it's potentially reductive?
You know, it's interesting because I'm a poet that has always explored identity. And I think it's important on an individual level to, you know, investigate who you are, what your belief system is, where it is you come from, where it is you want to go. But I do think that there are times where there's a level in which it is, you know, we get categorized. And I'm okay with a category if you feel like you can move and be fluid within it. My problem with category is that if you feel like suddenly you want to shift and do something else, or what does that mean if I'm a woman poet, if I'm a feminist poet, does that mean that I can't write a heteronormative sexual poem? Does it mean that I can't write a queer poem? Does it mean that I can't write a poem from a masculine point of view? Does it mean, you know, and I struggle with that sometimes because I said this to a friend one time, and she said she wanted to make me a t-shirt that said it, which is, you know, when I signed up for poetry, I didn't sign up for anything limited.
Absolutely.
And so I don't really necessarily abhor categories, but I abhor limitations.
Absolutely. And I mean, as a writer, to be limited is completely crushing the entire process, really. Yeah. Well, you mentioned as well the polemic earlier. Do you think that our emphasis on female writers, for example, has a marginalizing effect on male writers?
I think that when we think about those categories, and that, you know, whether or not giving attention or spotlighting Black women writers as opposed to white women writers, all of those things, you know, I don't think that's not necessary at times, but I do think what we're always looking at is when you look at what the norm has been for so long, and that when you sit down in a classroom and ask people, you know, to think of poets, you know, they say Robert Frost, they say Walt Whitman, they say, you know, I mean, all of these, you typically get a list of 10 men, and 10 white men, you know, and so I think that it's important to recognize that when I do think that there are people that are feeling marginalized right now, and I think white men in particular are feeling marginalized right now, and you know, I think it's a time to sit with that and to think about that and to be uncomfortable perhaps with it. But I don't necessarily think it's a problem. And I don't think it's an overcorrecting. I don't. I think that it's an engaging. And I also think that when we have issues with it, we're focusing on the myth of scarcity. And I don't believe in that myth. I think scarcity is a lie. I think there is room for all of us. And the more we recognize that as a poetry and literary community, I think the better we will be as to help, you know, helping each other out. And to quote the wonderful Robin Wall Kimmerer, who said, "All flourishing is mutual." That's something I return to a lot, and I focus on that. So yeah.
Lovely. And you talk about not there's space for everyone, and not wanting to limit writers. And I couldn't agree more, because I refer to your poem Wife a little bit further on, but a woman who is perhaps put in a category of a feminist female poet can, of course, talk about doing a husband's laundry if she wants to. Surely that is relevant in the name of gender equality, because to marginalize such things, to marginalize many women and many men and many, very, very interesting. Okay, so my next question is about your poem Wife. In this poem, you address a conflict I think a lot of women struggle with. And we're going to focus on women because of the contents of the poem. But it's this yearning to give yourself over to somebody you love and wanting to be theirs in a traditional romantic sense, yet also fearing that it may diminish you. So my first part of the question is, do you think that these terms we use, husband and wife, and even marriage, are outmoded? And if so, should we create new meanings for these terms?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I mean, I think that we're at a time where language is really shifting very quickly. That we're adding language to the dictionaries. We're losing a lot of our native languages consistently and constantly. And so I think examining phrases and things that we take for granted is a really smart use of our time, because especially if we're in the literary community, words are everything. We claim that words are everything, and then sometimes we're like, oh, that doesn't matter. But no, language is everything, and so, I there is an outdated sense, I think, even to those phrases. I have, before my husband and I got married, I preferred the term partner. And I like that idea. There's an equality in it. Like, this is my partner. Like, this is this even thing. And it's still a term that I use a lot. But I would love to see what happens in the next, and I bet there is a shift in the next 10 years in which we see some of those phrases and terms go away, or maybe, blossom into something else.
Definitely adapt. I think we're getting to a point where, I mean, this is my personal opinion, but I actually think the term feminism has become outdated. In terms of,
yeah, I mean, feminism is equality.
Yes. Yes.
So it does feel like it does feel like it's getting, even in the last 2 years, I felt that.
Quite convoluted. It's such a broad topic, and to term all of it with this one stamp. And I think a lot of people also have very old-fashioned connotations of what feminism is. I mean, there's all the different waves and all the different degrees, I suppose, if I can say degrees of feminism. Yeah. And still in terms of this poem Wife, it really hooked me, because like I say, I think so many women have experienced this. And it really it's the pull, because you think, can I be a strong, independent woman and truly believe in gender equality in all spheres of society, and yet also adore a man and do things for a man, things that are often very traditional, things your grandmother would do for her husband. So it actually blew my mind when I first read that poem.
Thank you.
So along those lines. Oh, did you? How so?
It was an interesting, I hadn't really realized that I was struggling with that word before we got married. And I sat down and I thought, I was like, I don't know if I want to be a wife. Like, just the word was very, it had a lot. I felt like I was dragging many women behind me who had been wives in ways they maybe did not want to be wives. And, so I think it was, that the poem was a truthful reconciliation for myself.
And that's the one of the wonderful things about writing, is that you can reconcile with things. You can make sense of them and work through them, even when you're not even aware that they were an issue that your mind was trying to deal with.
Yes. Yeah.
So what do you think, it's my last question related to gender, but what do you think is coming in the future regarding gender equality? What are the next steps we need to take? What needs to be done? What needs to change?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot that still needs to happen. I mean, at least within, if you look at the world globally in terms of women leaders, we still are not anywhere near where we need to be. You know, and how can we change the world and alter it for good in a lasting and monumental way if we're not in leadership positions? I selfishly say that as someone who has never been interested in running for office. So those who are interested in running for governmental positions, please do it. But I think that that is something that we really need to attend to. You know, and I also think that we need to make room for people who are transgender and to recognize that, and to also make room for the fact that that roles can shift, right? That someone doesn't have to be this or that. And, you know, like I said, it's like that idea of categories. You know, are they just limiting us? Are they just saying that you are this, so you must do this? Or, you know, and I just find that very unhelpful. And I think we have to get really creative. I think we have to get very vulnerable. And I think that we're going to have to open ourselves up to what it means when we talk about gender, even in terms of our language, in terms of our nouns and our pronouns. And I, for one, envision something a lot more fluid, a lot more open. And I'm hoping that's the case.
I hope so too. I think we've still got a lot of work to do, but at the same time, we can also look back and see how dramatically things have changed.
100%, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so in your poem, another one I absolutely love, the contract says we'd like the conversation to be bilingual. Such a biting tone to that poem. But in that poem, you talk about how a lot of the time when we hear stories of others suffering, we're uncomfortable but not complicit. Do you think that social media allows us to be aware of social issues, to feel a part of them, but still to be distanced from them?
Yes, I think that's a great question. And I think it can be indicative of our society right now on the whole, because I think that it's very easy to feel engaged and active without actually being engaged and active.
Absolutely.
I think it's very easy to be to focus on judging the other without turning that gaze and interrogating the self. I think that people can feel like they have done their work by sending a tweet, and that is not work.
No. 140 whatnot characters.
Right. And and so I think that there's something about the performative aspect of social media that I find very terrifying in some ways. I think it can be so useful, in sharing poems and checking in with people and creating community. I think it can have some wonderful elements to it. But I do think there's a level in which we can perform our rage, we can perform our engagement, and then we can leave that social media space and not actually be that shifted and changed by what the events have shown us. And that's something that I feel really is important, because it's one thing to name the thing, it's one thing to say the thing, it's another thing to really shift who you are and interrogate your own bias and your own self-interest and what it means to be yourself in a time when more and more we're seeing the divisiveness in our world.
Well, that's one of the criticisms of social media, and I do feel social media has a very bad rap, especially among educators. But and I agree with you. There's so much good to it. For example, sharing poetry, sharing people's artworks. But one of the criticisms is it is outwardly focused. I was reading an article about the increase in teenage depression and anxiety, and they cited social media use as one of the factors because, again, it's giving you the idea that you've got these relationships, but you're not feeling them. And there's not that much. There's not necessarily that much inward reflection and introspection.
Yeah, and then how easy it is to do harm to another, right?
Absolutely.
And not know you're doing harm. And even I have had moments that, you know, on Twitter where I feel like I want to say something, you know, and kind of bring down somebody else because they've hurt someone else, you know, it's usually not me, but someone that I want to defend, or, you know, and I really try to avoid it because it feels so toxic to me. And every time I've engaged in that way, I've immediately felt almost physically sick, like, oh, that's not right. Yeah, I think there's something about the fact that we're not in the same room, that we're not seeing each other's faces, you know, we're not next to each other's body heat. We're not the person getting nervous or feel uncomfortable with what we're saying or cry. You know, I really think that there's, that we need that as a society to see that our words have impact and that our engagement with others says so much about ourselves.
It does. It's a direct reflection. Absolutely. I mean, we're listening to you say that to an extent, it almost dehumanizes the person to whom you're speaking, the person whose post you're commenting on, which is a scary thought.
It is, and it's very easily done.
Very easily, absolutely. Well, that's the whole thing too. It's the click of a button. You don't actually necessarily see the impacts.
No, you can go, you can really say something harmful and then go about your day and, you know, think of yourself as a good person and think, oh, well, that was, you know, they did this and they deserve it. And you
absolutely.
pick up your kids from school and you feel normal, but, you know, how is that person's day after that? And what have you won? What have you accomplished? And it's very interesting that, you know, we haven't really quite found a way to confront it and engage with it in a real way yet. I'm interested to see what will happen in the next, you know, coming years.
So am I. I think in a decade or so, we'll look back in horror and amusement at the way we've engaged with social media. I always think I'm so glad we didn't have it when I was a teenager.
Oh, me too. I would have been devastated all the time.
Yeah. I'm still too sensitive.
Me too.
Okay, well, along those lines, you've said before in an interview, I think it was, how poetry can really allow us to connect with the self. We're talking about here, you know, the externalization versus really being internal thinking, being introspective, making peace with the various issues we find problematic. So how have you used poetry during this COVID-19 pandemic to reconnect with yourself and to cope with what's going on globally?
Yeah, you know, it's been a hard time to write, but I have been writing. And I think a lot of it is that, you know, sometimes the poems aren't complete. They don't feel like, they just feel like drafts, but I feel like I'm using them more as just sort of proof of life. And they're just like, they're saying, I feel like most of the poems are saying, I'm here, I'm still here. You know, I'm still breathing. I still am in my body, and the trees are still growing and the birds are still coming, and that sort of engagement and witnessing of the world has been really important, because I think it's very easy, especially as introverts, and a lot of poets are, to just withdraw and be completely overwhelmed by the quiet and silence. And there's a benefit to that. But I think that that engaging with the page, even if you're not even considering audience right away, but just saying like, this is, I'm still here, is really important. And I think a lot of the work I've been doing right now is basically just saying that, is witnessing pain, witnessing global grief, and just and listening. You know, the poems are much more about receiving, I think, than putting myself into the world.
Interesting. You say a lot of your poems just feel like drafts. How do you discern whether or not a poem is finished?
For me, the poem, I generally write a bunch of drafts, like I'll write 30 poems in a month, and then I'll put them aside and I'll wait sometimes 2 months, and then I go back and then I start to edit them.
Okay.
Um, and so then in that process, I can look at them and think, okay, is this one, did it have something, or does it need to go, Uh, and some of them do. Some of them get in, tossed in the trash bin. But some of them I save, edit, and I think when, for me, I start to feel like it is engaging with someone beyond me, and I can really feel like it's talking to someone else. And then when it feels like there's some sort of truth to it that is even surprising me, that I'm witnessing something like, oh, this is something that I have been thinking, but I didn't know how to say it, and this poem is saying it. And then finally, I think it's when I read all my poems out loud over and over again, and I think when I can hear it and really hear the musicality and sonic work of the poem come to life, then it feels much more complete, and I can feel like, okay, this is done.
So when you feel it can communicate something of value, not just to yourself, to your readers.
Yeah, I think that's true, and even if the reader really is myself, it needs
Yeah.
to at least be doing that work, right? That there is something, there is an effort to connect, as opposed to this is just something to put on a page.
And interesting, you're talking about your poems of late have been more about receiving than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
So poetry as an act of giving and receiving.
Yeah, I feel like it's very much about witnessing and listening and like seeing and, absorbing, as opposed to these are the things that happen to me, right? But instead thinking this is what I am seeing. And I think that's a different type of energy. And I think it's useful. And I think right now maybe that's what we're supposed to be doing is not so much a leaning back, but an active witnessing, an active beholding of this huge global crisis slash initiation, if you will. I think it's important to know that witnessing is also a powerful act.
It is, and to just carry on with our lives during all of this isn't quite possible. You're either denying it and living with your head in the sand, or I don't know, in a state of grief. Something I found interesting is with all of this, there's been a lot of talk of collective grief and grieving for something we don't quite understand. Do you think that that's come through in any writing you've read lately?
Yeah, I feel like that's something that, I think collective grief is really what we're feeling, and it's hard because we're also having a pre-grief is happening. Like we're also seeing what's coming next. So it's this active process. Yeah, I think my biggest fear is that we just dismiss it. Is that we just somehow keep our head down. We bake our sourdough bread. And we don't, really think about the lives that are being lost. And I think I worry that we will become hardened to that, and that I think that will catch up with us if we're not really engaging with that loss. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, if you look at I've always been a fan of the Gaian hypothesis. And if you look at it from that perspective, it's very much a wake-up call.
Yeah.
So to not take any note of it and just carry on as we did before could be potentially devastating.
Right, and it's something we've done before when we think about the global climate crisis, right? It's
Absolutely.
consistent is that we think, well, you know, if I recycle, I'll be fine. You know?
But again, you're touching very much on the, I think, a bit of a 21st century attitude of, yeah, I've done my bit. I've recycled that plastic bottle, or I've posted on social media.
Yes, yes.
um, so, oh, you may have read a very controversial article written by a woman called Rebecca Watts entitled The Cult of the Noble Amateur.
I haven't read it actually.
It's very interesting. I highly recommend it. It was published in the PN Review, I think 2018.
Okay, I'm writing it down.
It's scathing, but it turns absolutely hilarious. But she writes specifically about young female poets, bearing in mind she is one. And she basically opines that contemporary poets, particularly those using social media platforms to gain acclaim, for example, you know, Insta poets, she opines that they are favoring accessibility, which is another catchphrase that's going around in poetry at the moment, accessibility over craft. One of her lines, and you'll see what I mean about scathing, and I quote, she says, "Of all the literary forms, we might have predicted that poetry had the best chance of escaping social media's dumbing effect." So what do you think about the changing nature of literature and the changes that are happening to the ways we produce and consume it?
Yeah, I think that's, you know, I think that those go, what we talked about before, and the idea of social media and the performative aspect goes directly hand in hand with that trend. You know, I think that if you are writing poems to perform, I don't actually think that there's anything wrong with that. I think, you know, creating more poems is like creating more flowers. Like I have no issue with that. Like, you know, that's fine. I may not love all the flowers, you know, some of the flowers may not be my cup of tea, but I'm okay with that. I think the problem becomes when we don't recognize what is the actual sort of craft of it, right? And also what our legacy is. And I think what is more and more interesting and somewhat harmful, I think, is that we're forgetting our past. So that we have some poets that are performing and they hear a poet and they think, oh, I see an Insta poet do this, I'm going to do that, I'm a poet. But they have no idea who Audre Lorde is. Or they have, you know, they have no idea who Emily Dickinson is. Or they have no idea who, you know, Gabriela Mistral is. Or, you know, and this is sort of that aspect of like, okay, but if you're going to enter into this, you know, you don't start painting and then never look at paintings.
Absolutely.
Right. And I think that to me is where we get that disconnect, is that it becomes more about what I am doing in my world and my performance without engaging with what has come before us or what's even around us, you know? So yeah, I have no issue with the poems that are being created, even if the poems aren't necessarily great. But what I do have an issue with is the fact that there seems to be a lack of connection to the legacy and history and the sort of ongoing book that we're all in. And I think it's something to honor. It's something that I feel like needs to be honored. I feel really, really strongly about honoring our ancestors and honoring those poets that have broken, you know, huge boundaries in order to write what they wrote. And I think that in order to really call yourself a poet and to really feel like you're doing the work, there needs to be at least some engagement with those that have come before us.
I agree with you. I think it's almost, it's willful ignorance, because if you consider what Ezra Pound did for poetry, could Instagram poetry even exist in its particular form if someone like Ezra Pound hadn't come along? So yes, to sever yourself from that connection is actually impossible.
Right. It's very interesting when when a lot of the Insta poets are writing, you know, with all lowercase and no, and you think, well, could they have done that without E.E. Cummings?
Exactly.
Right? Like, I mean, there's
Exactly.
all these, it's very interesting. And so, but again, I don't really, I mean, and I think there are actually some Insta poets that are actually quite good. I mean,
Mm,
and that's the other thing. I worry again about condemning a category or like, oh, this is, you know, because I think
mm,
that there are some people who are quite talented and maybe don't have the resources to go to a brick and mortar MFA and go into debt paying for, you know, so I also want to recognize that there is that sort of great equality that social media
mm,
often allows, which is that maybe I wasn't allowed to study with these 10 notable poets in this
yeah.
prestigious university, but I can still write. Um, but I do think what I want to focus on in that engagement is you don't have to necessarily attend that to have that equality, but you do need to read.
Yes.
You know, and you can do that without, you know, many resources. But I feel like that's something that I see in um in that sort of longing for attention and worrying about creating a brand before you're even engaged with your own poetry. You know, I think
Interesting.
that's
Yeah.
very interesting. Like, oh, we're going to create a brand for myself,
Mm,
but what's my content? What is my, you know, what am I trying to say? Who am I engaged with? Who's my audience? You know, I don't know. I find I found those big questions important, and I'm sure some, you know, a lot of people are asking them, you know, but then I think there are some poems out there and some poets out there that aren't.
absolutely. And I mean, to call a poem good or bad is of course also opening a whole can of worms.
Yeah.
But I think it's wonderful though that basically anyone now, as long as they've got access to a cell phone and internet connectivity, can find a platform to share their works. Because even if very few people are reading it, your mom and your best friend, you still got that platform. You've still got that ability to put what you are writing, what you are feeling out into the world. So in many ways, it's a completely wonderful thing. But then,
Right.
of course, the boundary, I suppose, which is also a bit problematic between a poet and a person who just writes for fun,
Mhm.
becomes a little more blurred.
Yeah, and maybe that's okay, and maybe that boundary is
Mm,
fine. You know, um, maybe that needs to be blurred, and maybe there's a classist, you know, element in that too. But I don't know. I feel like there is something to be said for at least like if you're engaging in this art form, that there has to be some recognition, at least, of the larger conversation with all poetry. Um, but yeah, I mean, I do think there's some really healthy benefits to being able to write poems and share them. And I mean, writing is healing,
mm.
and you know, and sharing those poems is healing. So I think, I don't know. I guess I don't want to dismiss it, and I don't want to feel like I know that a lot of people are like, oh, they really sort of trash them, and I don't feel that way. You know, like again, I think that, you know, maybe there's a dumbing down, but I mean, is taking a picture of a tree with your Instagram post like, you know, like, or a bird when you're not Audubon? Like, I mean, I don't know. I mean, this is, you know, well, we have to, we're engaging in the world in a different way, and maybe those
Mm.
poems won't last, but maybe they're having a moment and they're serving a purpose.
Well, I always think of when Gutenberg refined the printing press, and everyone said, no, the monks are going to be so lazy now. And I mean, that revolutionized education and politics and propaganda. Not that those are all necessarily good, but whenever there's a big change, there's always the reluctant few. But
Mm-hmm.
it'll be interesting to see what happens with how we define literature,
Yeah.
because these boundaries are becoming increasingly fluid, which, as you say, could be an incredibly good thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think for a long time the publishing world has needed a revolution. I think it's
Mm,
long been curated and in a way that has favored the male aesthetic. the white male aesthetic. And I think that it's going to be very interesting to see what these kind of platforms, as we continue, bring us and show us. And I like the idea of sort of going around a gatekeeper and making your own art. I mean, that to me is revolutionary.
Absolutely.
And so I think, yeah, I guess that's why it's like, I feel like I want to praise them, but I also know that I walk into classrooms and teachers are like, oh, it's terrible poetry. I'm like, well, maybe some of it is terrible poetry, but maybe some people get something out of it. I don't know. I like the idea of finding our own ways to connect with other people and make art. And, I have very little to say about not like, I have very little to say despairingly about that act, because I think that is a really important act, to make things and to feel like you have the right to make things.
I agree. That's something that hasn't been the case for a long time. And I mean, poetry has got a bit of a reputation for being quite elitist.
Absolutely.
So to break that down can only be a positive thing.
The same thing happened when people talked about slam poetry and performance poetry. Everyone thought, oh, this is ruining poetry. I was like, what are you talking about? These are some of the best poems I've heard. And then, there are people that could actually, really perform a poem and also really write a poem. And a lot of some, you think of Patricia Smith, I mean, she can do both of those things. And I think that, so it harkens back to that same argument where people were like, oh no, this what's happening?
Well, I mean, poetry as well was traditionally performance-based. So what
I've always thought of it as closer to song than
it is.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. I mean, otherwise the line between prose and poetry blurs a little bit as well. So I've made a little bit of mention of MANCOSA's iTeach lab. So basically what it is, it's this multidisciplinary group of hubs, all of which focus on basically giving our students access to cutting edge technology whilst preparing them further regarding the knowledge and skills they need to cover for their studies. And one of the hubs is the amphitheater, which focuses on the language arts. In your opinion, how important is it for children and teenagers to engage with literature in terms of preparing them for adult life?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's incredibly important. I think that literature teaches us empathy. And I think that it also brings us closer to an idea of what language can do. I think for a long time when I was younger, I thought I must be the only person that feels this way or is hurt this way or experiences the world in this wonder, and then I would read something and think, oh, no, this is someone else feels this way. And I think that is essential. I think that it not only connects us to other people, to other cultures, to the idea of what it is to, we can be so microscopic in our own life, and then what it is to look outward and to realize that there's a huge world out there. And then beyond that, I think it also teaches us empathy and engagement with ourselves and interrogation. And you start to see, okay, what is this poem or sentence doing in a way that might relate to myself? I think that on another level, it gives us some sense of history and legacy, and the idea that we've been using the same language for so long. I mean, the English language in particular, right, is just massive and messy and it's so complicated. And then you can look at poems written in English or even translated into English, and look back and think of how the language has shifted. And it's an engagement, I think, not just with the self and not just with the heart and the brain and the mind, but with the real human endeavor from the beginning.
Well, do you have any famous poets if you've had a particularly rough day, is there a poet you always go back to, almost as comfort food?
I think that in terms of a poet that, like, if I really need to find some hope and I'm feeling like I can't get there, I think Ross Gay is a poet that does that for me. And he's a contemporary of mine. We're friends, but he has a way of looking, and not that some of his poems aren't very dark and full of grief, but he has a way of pulling out what it is to survive that I really admire.
Must be interesting to know someone as a friend and as a poet you admire.
Yeah. Yeah, there's actually so many of the people that I work with and write with and are colleagues with, they're people whose book I admire and would go, over and over to their poems.
And do you have a new poetry collection in the works?
Maybe.
Maybe. You can remain vague on that.
Yeah, I think there's the sixth book is being, I think, somehow coming together maybe right now.
Oh, that is very exciting. Have you considered doing any prose?
I've written actually quite a bit of prose, but only really as an experiment. I believe in teaching myself by doing things. Okay. So I really wanted to teach myself how to write a novel. So I've written 2, and then a young adult novel. None of them are very good. I mean, they're good, but they're now they're kind of. But I learned so much from them, and I love doing it. But I kind of did them as exercises. So I've actually written quite a bit of prose, and I think that I'm working on some essays right now. But I do like that poetry leaves room for mystery and an unknowing. And I feel like sometimes with prose, they expect you to have the answer, and I do not have the answer.
Who does? Yeah, I actually read, I think it was in an interview you did, that you spoke about how with poetry there's an acceptance of complexity, there's acceptance of this unknowability. Yes. You don't have to come to a conclusion, and that is the wonderful thing about it. Absolutely.
Right. And you can even be suspicious of wisdom, like you can have a moment where you think you figured it out, and then you think later, man, is that true?
I was completely off track. I saw a tweet, you retweeted the poet Kevin Young's explanation of talent is ultimately coming down to endurance. Right. So what is your advice for young poets out there who are trying to gain readership?
Yeah, I think that was a quote from James Baldwin.
Oh, was it? Okay.
Yeah, I think, I do think it comes down to endurance. I think that it's the idea that no one can tell you to write, right? I mean, but if you wake up in the morning and something is nagging you or getting into your spirit and you feel like you must write, then you do it. And I think that is really what the definition of being a writer is that we have to do it. We have to do it to survive. Like, it is the way we engage with the world. It is how we witness. It is how we, it's literally how we like listen to the world. And so I think that it is endurance, but it's also a natural state of being. And I think for those out there that have trouble writing or can't find that state, and maybe that's okay. Maybe you can write here and there, but you don't. No one needs to be forced to be a writer if that's not what you want. And I do think that it comes down to you want to do it. You want to practice it. You want to get better at it. It is a desirous act, to sit down to the page and write. And I think all the writers I know that are real writers we love it. We love it, we hate it, but we must do it. And we keep doing it, and I think that's the key, is to not give up. So even if you feel like you need some time off, or you can't actually write right in the moment, that's fine. But then you show up in a year from now, or you show up in 6 months and you bring it your all. but I do think it is about really actually writing. You know, a lot of people have ideas. You know, if you ever want to know, you can just say, well, I'm thinking about writing a novel, and 10 people will call you and say, you should write a novel. I had an idea for it. You know, and everyone has an idea for something, but it's the actual act of creating it and writing it that makes you a writer.
And without wanting to, without it being a drive, there doesn't really seem too much points.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I mean, it's not going to make you rich.
Absolutely.
So,
It should.
You want to do it because you love it. You want to do it because it is, you know, activating something within you that needs to be activated. But yeah, I think that it comes down to endurance, and it also comes down to, I think we don't talk about it enough, but it comes down to pleasure too. I do think that we often talk about writing as really hard and torture, and like we talk about this like it's just devastating, you know, but I do think there should be some sort of pleasure in it. And if there isn't, I would ask yourself deeply what it is that you're working on and whether or not you want to shift it up.
Well, I don't know if you've read Stephen King's On Writing.
I have, yeah.
He sort of positions it like that, like grit your teeth and endure. And I know there's one part where he says, do not leave your desk, just sit and write. And when I read that, it actually sounded torturous. It didn't inspire me at all.
I do think that, especially for prose writers and long form writers, that is something that like you have to do. You have to bring yourself to the seat and, you know, get there every day, and you're writing at least, 2,000 words a day or whatever it is. And I do think there's an act of that feels like, okay, what do I even have to say? I don't think poetry works in the same way. I think I actually enjoy writing that way. Like, I think that's why I've written novels. It's just because I'm like, oh, what is it to write 2,000 words a day and create these worlds or whatever. But poetry, I think, it kind of sneaks up on you. You know, you're doing the dishes, and suddenly it's like, oh, I gotta go. It's much more of a relationship, I think, to the ethereal spirit than that sort of like, okay, I've got to hammer this out. Poems don't relate to that. They think you tell poems that you want something from them, and they say no.
Okay, well, that is a wonderful note to end on. I really look forward to reading more of your writing.
Thank you.
And if you're happy to do so, if you could read Triumph Like a Girl, that would be fantastic.
I would love to. I'd be honored. How to triumph like a girl. I like the lady horses best. How they make it all look easy. Like running 40 miles per hour is as fun as taking a nap or grass. I like their lady horse swagger after winning. Ears up, girls, ears up. But mainly, let's be honest, I like that they're ladies. As if this big, dangerous animal is also a part of me. That somewhere inside the delicate skin of my body, there pumps an 8-pound female horse heart. Giant with power, heavy with blood. Don't you want to believe it? Don't you want to lift my shirt and see the huge beating genius machine that thinks, no, it knows it's going to come in first.
Thank you so much. It has been such a pleasure having you here chatting to me today. And I know a lot of our students are very excited to listen to this interview. So I can't thank you enough for your time.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you for all your wonderful and astute questions. It'll make me think for the rest of the day about poetry and my engagement with the world.
Oh, that's fantastic. It was such a pleasure to meet you.